Hey, how's it going? My name's Daniel, and this is a follow-up to my last video on how to manage all your game consoles. More specific, you fuck. That one more specifically went into if you have multiple consoles that you're playing, how to, kind of play each of them and make sure they're not collecting dust, or if you have limited space, etc., etc. This video, though, is going to talk about something I didn't get to touch on in that video, and that is specifically if you have multiple consoles, where to buy your games on what platform. And I think it's one of those things that, we don't really think about on the grand scheme of things. We usually just have our, platform of choice. We pick the one system, and that's kind of it. So I figured I would kind of share with you my experience and my methods for what consoles I buy what games on, and kind of how I determine that whole process. So I think the first thing to figure out is what each platform does, or each console you're playing does for your little gaming ecosystem. This is something that I've kind of I'm not going to say invented or coined or whatever. It's not really something that I didn't take it from anybody to my knowledge. But basically, in my head, I have this little ecosystem of all my games, all my platforms, from the older stuff that you can see behind me to the big three systems now. And each one has a purpose in its where it's set up, right? Where I buy my games, how I buy my games. For the longest time, I've only been on PlayStation and Nintendo. And the thing about that is PlayStation was the easy system to just get all my big releases and those exclusives, and then the Nintendo systems were just those exclusives, right? Games that I couldn't get anywhere else. But then this generation, I got an Xbox Series X and S, and that messed up the whole thing, especially because with the Nintendo Switch as well, that's when I started going and just buying games digitally. Because of the Switch's form factor, because of the way it works, I decided to just make the Switch my go-to handheld device, and because of its hybrid form factor, I feel like it's just one of those things where it's easier to have all your games digitally on like a little micro SD card than, anywhere else. So with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and cut to the chase. I'm not going to mention the retro stuff. I think that is more unique to me, but I think a lot of us can relate to owning either both an Xbox and a PlayStation, or, a PlayStation and a Switch. I think that's a really common scenario, honestly. But for me specifically, I'm going to go through each platform and how I decide what games to buy and how I buy them. So to start off with number one, the PlayStation 5 for me is very specifically my physical only console. The PS5, honestly, to me is more like a Blu-ray player, but for video games, right? If there is a video game that's going to come out, a big story-driven game. Some recent examples are Hogwarts Legacy, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and God of War Ragnarok. Those are like the most three recent games I've picked up on the PlayStation. And the thing is I don't necessarily... this is, again, very personal to me, but my opinion is I don't really enjoy the way PlayStation handles digital purchases. I think the whole way they went about going from PS4 to 5 initially was kind of garbage, right? They were promising free upgrades, and then they tried charging upgrades, and then everyone got mad. So like, oh no, let's fix it. And then they're like, okay, but psych, going forward, they are going to be charging upgrades. Well, Xbox's approach is very straightforward with smart delivery. So for that reason, when it comes to the PS5, if there's a game I'm interested in and it's a big single player game, something I'm going to sit down, spend a lot of hours on, and ideally all the game is on the disc. This matters to me the most, right? Because if my disc is useless, which the only exception I've made recently is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, but if that disc is useless without a big update, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get it on the disc outside of just a collection standpoint, which is what I did with Star Wars Jedi Survivor. I have Jedi Fallen Order on PS4, it just made sense to get Survivor on the PS5. But going forward, the more we get into this generation, I think Modern Warfare 2 was probably the biggest example. That disc had 70 megabytes of data. You virtually was just a physical access key to the game. I bought that digitally on Xbox because, again, I just feel more comfortable with the way Xbox handles those digital purchases. So that's kind of the first step into figuring all this out, right? Again, this can be convoluted. This can be very straight simple depending on you and how your preferences are. But for me specifically, first I have to ask myself, is it a physical or digital game, and which one does it make more sense to get if it is, both? So with that said, I also look at what kind of game it is, right? As I mentioned, the PS5 is mostly my single player stuff, big cinematic kind of games, right? God of War Ragnarok, Uncharted, The Last of Us, right? Those exclusives, but also the third parties. Hogwarts Legacy, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, right? So any game that I feel like is just better to be playing, on the couch, relaxing, I'm gonna get on the PS5 if it meets that criteria, but also the physical media part. And that's where things are getting a little more complicated, because as we move on to the Xbox, what kind of games I decide to buy on Xbox traditionally is just my multiplayer games. Call of Duty, Battlefield, free-to-play stuff too, right? Fortnite, Rocket League, whatever. All those games I go ahead and play on the Xbox. But a little game recently is starting to change my mind here, because now we're seeing Alan Wake 2 is going to be digital only, and that changes a lot for me because, again, as I mentioned before, I prefer the way Xbox does things over Sony when it comes to their digital library. The way that, for example, Call of Duty Black Ops is still available on your Series X if you bought it all the way long ago on the 360. Plus the free upgrades, FPS boost, game boost, all that crap. Absolutely phenomenal. But the problem here is Alan Wake 2 is one of those games where it's a single player driven game, right? So I kind of have decided going forward that if it is a digital third-party purchase, I'm going to get it on Xbox. If it's a physical third-party purchase, I'm going to get it on PlayStation. And then now my deciding factor is basically if it's multiplayer or not. If it is multiplayer focused, I'm going to get it on Xbox. If it's not, probably get it physically on PlayStation. But then we have the Switch, because the Switch you would think is a straightforward cut-dry scenario. You just get those exclusives, right? I love my Marios, I love my Pokemon, my Zelda, whatever. But there's some games that I believe are better on the Switch. And this scenario is, again, one of those things that you have to decide on. Do you value the novelty, I guess you could call it, of bringing your games on the go with you? That is something I like to do because I am a truck driver. So when I get downtime at work, I love to pop out my Switch and just play some games. But sometimes I get tired of playing Tears of the Kingdom or Mario Kart, or sometimes I just don't have time to really dive deep into a game like that. So recent example here is Catherine. Catherine Full Body. It is a game I've been wanting forever. I knew, right, it's a remake of a PS3 game, so it's going to run really well on the Switch, for the most part. But also the kind of game it is works really well on the Switch, right? It's basically a puzzle game. It's basically a puzzle game with like graphic novel. I mean, it's a rough explanation, but the point is, right, it's basically, it's a very simple game. So to have that kind of game on the Switch and, on the go, perfectly fine. I think that is one of those situations where I think it's better. Another good examples are Lego games. I have Lego The Incredibles, Lego Harry Potter Collection, and Lego City Undercover. Those three games, all available on PlayStation, but I feel like, or Xbox, of course, but the Switch is perfect because those are pick up and play games. Makes the Switch a very good system for some third-party titles, but for the most part, I'm sticking to, first-party games on the Switch. Okay, so to round out the video, I figured a very good way to kind of put some of my ideas into example to show you how I would go forward with some of the games coming out is to do just that, right? I want to look at a few games and think about what system I would most likely buy it on. So the first game here is going to be Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater. I should have just called it Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater, but whatever. That game is going to be probably the game I get on PS5. It's going to be a big single player experience, right, as we all know. And it just, ideally, from what I've heard, I haven't heard anything otherwise, but to my knowledge, there won't be some big day one patch or update or anything like that. So that game should be all on the disc. And again, if it isn't, then I might get that on Xbox just because I don't have any other Metal Gear Solid games at the moment. So if I were to jump into that series, I wouldn't mind just starting fresh on the Xbox with a digital library in that specific thing. That is another thing I forgot to mention, by the way. I'll touch on it here real quick, is if I'm already deep into a franchise on one platform, I try to stick with it. For example, Jedi Fallen Order to Jedi Survivor. Technically, with my current standpoints, I should have bought it on the Xbox Series X, but I went ahead and got it on PS5 because I already had the previous game on the PS4. But again, Metal Gear Solid coming to all platforms, that is something that I will just get on the PS5. Now, when it comes to the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection, that is something I'm a little torn on specifically, because if I'm getting Metal Gear Solid 3 Remake on the PS5, then the collection I feel like makes a lot of sense to get physically on PS5 as well. But because they're smaller, right, games, I mean, Snake Eater's in itself is pretty good, but it's a PS2 game, you know? So any of those games that are coming to that collection, I think would work great on the Nintendo Switch, honestly. Like, I think they are perfect. So I was thinking that would be the best way to go. I feel like Metal Gear Solid is going to be in its remake phase, kind of like how Capcom has been with Resident Evil. So I really think that going forward, Konami is going to be really pushing out Metal Gear Solid after Solid, and, you know, they're going to be beautiful remakes. So I might get all the remakes physically on PlayStation, but I might get those collections on the Switch, because I feel like those are going to be phenomenal titles to just pick up and play on the go. Now, there are some other titles here that I think could go either way. That 2D Prince of Persia game coming out, I think that would be perfect on the Switch. I think another thing to note is if you're not getting a huge performance drop, right, there are some games like The Witcher 3, right? We just got the Batman Arkham collection on the Switch. That's coming to Switch for this fall, I believe it is. So, you know, it's one of those things where you really have to look at the performance of it as well. As I mentioned, Catherine full body or fuller body, whatever. And, you know, those Lego games, the performance hit on Switch is very minimal, and, you know, they look good, they play fine. But a game like The Witcher or Skyrim, or maybe even these Batman Arkham games, those aren't really titles that I would say, yeah, get on Switch, unless you just desperately needed that handheld stuff. Now, with all this said, you're probably thinking, well, you're not really talking about Xbox too much, so where does that fit in? And, well, I'll tell you. Going forward, Xbox will probably become my primary system of choice when it comes to my games, because with the way Sony's going, and I talked about this in my live stream on Friday, so if you want to see more into that and get some more opinions on that, you know, go check that out. But in short, I am not too excited about the direction PlayStation is going with all of their, you know, live service titles. There's a few good ones that look interesting. Foam Stars seems interesting enough, but other than big games like Spider-Man 2, Wolverine, you know, I'm not really too interested in what they have to offer at the moment. So I think going forward, I'm probably going to move my collection of games digitally over to Xbox. And, you know, half of those games will be on Game Pass, because if you look at the games that were announced at the Xbox Game Showcase versus games that were announced at the PlayStation Showcase, there's a stark difference between who's doing what. And Xbox seems to be moving into this, you know, more single-player, narrative-driven kind of games versus PlayStation, who's really pushing that live service because they're really desperate about losing Call of Duty, you know. So with that said, if half of the games I'm going to get are going to come to Game Pass, you know, I don't buy Xbox first-party titles because I have Game Pass, but it's one of those things where those third-party titles, as we go forward, especially because I think the PS6, we might see only digital. I think that might be a thing, and I think even furthermore, we'll see more and more games either release digital only, right, like Alan Wake 2, for example, or we're going to see more and more games come with just not enough data on the disc to begin with, because these games are getting huge. So unless someone creates a quad-layer Blu-ray disc, right, there's not going to be enough data on the you know, hardware, the media itself, to warrant not just having a download. And again, those digital purchases, I feel a lot more comfortable with Xbox. Okay, so to recap everything, I think I'll keep it simple here. And basically, in short, if it is a Switch game, I'm getting it on Switch. Any first-party titles, obviously getting on Switch. If it is a game that I feel like doesn't have a huge performance, you know, downgrade or anything like that, or visual downgrade, I'll get it on Switch as well if the novelty of taking it on the go, right, works for that game, right? If it's a game that works well with just taking it and being able to go back and forth, perfect. It's a Switch game for me. If it's a big single-player cinematic experience that is on disc and mostly on disc, maybe a day one patch is okay for me, but, you know, it's got to be on the disc. I'm getting it on PS5, and if it's on Xbox, I'm gonna get it via Game Pass, or I'm gonna buy it digitally. I'm not buying physically for Xbox. So with that said, I hope that this kind of gave you some insights on how I do things, my thought process behind it, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on how you do it. If you have multiple systems, multiple platforms you play on, just let me know, right? And you know, I learn from you guys as well. So maybe I'll change the way I do things based on some suggestions you have. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you liked what you watched. Helps me out a ton. And like the video. That is the simplest thing anybody can do to help a small YouTube channel like mine. So with that said, thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.